Since the release of Super Mario Maker, the community found many crazy ways to build levels. We found ways to activate pipes once Mario takes damage. We found ways to forbid Mario to jump, to run, or to slow down. We found ways to build binary storage and build turn-based combat systems. We took a look at how all of this stuff works previously on this channel. But there is one super weird, incredibly powerful, and unimaginably complicated Mario Maker technique we never discussed in detail before. Namely, the giant gap and POW block memory. So with Mario Maker 2 around the corner, it's time for us to tie up some loose ends and to finally take a look at what are probably the most complex and weirdest techniques currently possible in Super Mario Maker. So you ready? Let's do this! Okay, so first things first, the giant gap. So check this out. Mario finds himself in the middle of a solid brick block labyrinth. Everything is fine. All that our plumber has to do here is to make his way through the confusing, totally not in danger of collapsing labyrinth while avoiding to touch the dangerous ouching saw blades that happen to live here too. Business as usual. After a while, Mario even finds a checkpoint. But this checkpoint is no ordinary checkpoint, but actually an evil troll checkpoint. Because if Mario decides to run into this evil fake checkpoint, then the floor transforms into shiny yet deadly coins. Because of course it does. That's one way to use the giant gap. Before we discuss what this mysterious and presumably gigantic gap looks like, let's first take a look at another use case for it. Here Mario finds himself in a long dark corridor that leads our plumber to a small mini challenge. As soon as he enters this room, he becomes entrapped and is forced to hit 3 question blocks at the top in order to be able to leave again. At first this may not sound like an out of the ordinary challenge for a heroic plumber. I mean, surviving such situations is what he does for a living. This and plumbing. But actually Mario has to make a really interesting choice here. See, there is a mushroom on tracks to the right. Usually eating each and every yum mushroom is the way to go. But actually not today. Because this mushroom is linked to a dangerous contraption. As soon as Mario takes a bite off of the delicious mushroom, 2 piranha plants get shot into the arena, which makes hitting the 3 question blocks significantly harder. So here Mario has to decide whether he wants to overcome this challenge small, or if he likes to be able to take an additional hit, but has to survive a much more difficult challenge as a trade-off. Hooray! So how did this stuff work? Well, that is actually surprisingly simple. We basically have a small, globally loaded contraption that activates a POW block or a P-switch as soon as the game lags. The game lags whenever Mario takes damage, eats a delicious power-up or activates a checkpoint. And the way we're able to test for this is by using the giant gap. What basically happens is this. We have a bullet blaster on top of a POW block on top of a POW block on tracks. Since all items on tracks are globally loaded, this contraption never unloads. But as soon as the game lags, something interesting happens. As soon as the game lags, a gap appears. This gap here. Namely a giant gap. So the reason I'm calling this 5 pixel gap a giant gap isn't because it is so gigantic, but because Mario Maker user Giant or Helgefan was, at least to my knowledge, the first one to put this really strange quirk to insanely good use. So as soon as the game lags, the POW block on top of the POW block on tracks suddenly is no longer on top of the POW blocks, but floats a couple of pixels above it. It is suddenly in the air and no longer has contact to the POW block at the bottom. If the current camera was more than 4 blocks away, this would mean that the POW block and the blaster above it are no longer on global ground, since they're in the air, and because of this, the blaster would despawn once the game lags. That's how the 2 contraptions worked. If the game lags, this POW block and bullet blaster disappear, which means that this POW block gets triggered. But that's enough theory. Let's do a quick Mario Maker experiment. Okay, so I just claimed that POW blocks become airborne for a moment when the game lags, as long as they're on top of a moving entity on tracks. The problem is, there is no way to visualize that, because the previous contraptions only did something when outside of the current camera border, since it uses the fact that items despawn as soon as they leave global ground when off-screen. We can't see bullet blasters off-screen. But luckily for us, there is an easy way to visualize this nonetheless. If our thesis of momentarily POW block airborneness is correct, that would mean that a POW block has to interact with a spring as soon as a giant gap appears. Because POW blocks in the air interact with springs, POW blocks on the ground don't interact with springs. Simple. So let's test this. Here we have a setup where POW blocks are on the ground, but should for a moment be in the air once the game lags. The POWs happily travel up and down and don't trigger the springs, but once we eat a mushroom and lag the game, hooray! The POW blocks are in the air and therefore bounce off of the spring. We just proved our thesis. Isn't science fun? So here we have our first principle of POW block airborneness. If the game lags while a POW block on tracks moves downwards, the POW block becomes airborne for a frame. Awesome. Let's try to put this knowledge to good use. Here our plumber finds himself in a small hallway. All that our heroic Princess Saver has to do here is to make his way safely through a couple of dangerous fireballs that try to burn him. Simple stuff. But once the fireball hallway lies behind him, stuff becomes more interesting. The famous level-ending X is sadly blocked by a nasty bullet blaster, and there is nothing in this room that could allow our Mario to get rid of the blaster. Nothing but this mushroom. So eating this mushroom has interesting consequences, because the second Mario eats this shroom, a P-switch timer starts, 2 bullet bills drop from the ceiling, and tons of evil fire-spitting plants enter the arena. How horrible. Now our plumber is forced to avoid all the hot and dangerous burning balls that are flying towards him until the P-switch expires. Because once the P-switch expires, the bullet blaster dies and the path towards the goal finally opens up. Hooray! Okay, so how did we wire all this stuff to this mushroom? Well, we made simple use of the first principle of POW block airborneness. It's super simple actually. Out of sight are just a couple of contraptions that activate a spring as soon as they detect lag. This is how we shoot the bullet bills down, this little contraption is how we trigger the P-switch, and this is how we get the piranha plants to suddenly drop down. Super simple stuff. So at the beginning of the video, I claimed that this stuff is among the most complex stuff currently known in Mario Maker. But so far, everything has been quite simple. So why did I make this horrendous claim? Well, because stuff is a bit more complicated. Let's do another experiment to show what I mean. Okay, so here we have the same setup we just used to our right and a very similar setup to the left. The only difference here is that the POW blocks once fall onto the moving item from above and once they jump onto it from below. Ninja style. So what happens here once the game lags? Well, our first principle of POW block airborneness tells us what will happen. All 4 POW blocks become airborne, hit the spring and bounce away, right? Well, let's test it. That's strange. Only the POWs that fell onto the moving item from above are bounced away. The ones that jumped onto the POW blocks ninja style aren't affected. Looks like we have a mistake in our thesis. Hooray! Isn't science fascinating? So here's the second principle of POW block airborneness. Apparently the first principle is wrong because of spawn order POW block memory. So what is POW block memory? See, all POW blocks are POW blocks, but no 2 POW blocks are the same. Each POW block has the information of when it spawned stored inside it. It remembers its spawning order. And weirdly enough, we're able to actually access this information. And this is where this stuff becomes ridiculously complicated. Okay, so if we want to understand why only the POW blocks that drop down from above are able to create a giant gap, then we need to discuss spawn order and stack behavior of items. So check this out. Here we once again have 2 very similar setups. We have 2 POW block towers that get picked up by a blue platform as soon as we activate it. The only difference here is that one tower is already put together in the editor while the other tower drops down from above. So in theory, we have the exact same tower twice here. And common sense would tell us that both POW towers behave in the exact same way as soon as they get picked up. But surprisingly, that's not what happens. Let's take a look. The tower to the right is a perfectly straight and beautiful POW block tower, but the tower to the left is equally beautiful, but behaves out of the norm. The POW blocks wiggle around. So that's the first difference between the 2 towers. But if we look closely, we can actually see another difference. Only the POW blocks to the left create a giant gap while moving down, while no giant gap appears in the tower to the right. Weird, isn't it? If we want to understand why this happens, we have to take a super close look into the order in which the game spawns entities. But since all of this stuff is incredibly dry, let's first take a look at a random Mario joke I just googled. So, why doesn't Mario need his own movie? Well, because he already is a blockbuster. So back to our spawn order studies. So when a screen gets loaded, like when we leave a door, then the game loads the entities on screen from the bottom to the top first, and second from the left to the right, meaning items that are placed lower get always loaded before items that are placed higher. And if two items are on the same vertical layer, then the item on the left always gets loaded first. The reason why this is important is because items remember the information in which order they spawned, and the physics calculation of Mario Maker is based on the spawn order of the entities. This is the reason why the two towers behave differently. The tower on the left is ordered in a way that the POW block at the bottom spawned first and the one at the top spawned last, while the other tower is ordered in the exact opposite way. This is the reason why they behave differently when on tracks. If we simplify this a bit, the reason why one tower wiggles while the other one is static is because the collision of each POW block against each POW block is once calculated from the bottom to the top, while the other tower calculates it in the reverse order. This gives us an incredibly powerful way to store information in Mario Maker. The order in which the POW blocks spawn is information that we can write, manipulate, and read. But before we take a look at how to actually read this information, let's Google another Mario joke. So, why did the chain jump tweet out the blog post? Well, because it was attached to this post. Anyway, so how to read stack ordered information? Well, we have two options. We can either use the wiggling or we can use the giant gap. Let's take a look at the wiggling first. Here we once again have a similar setup as before. Both setups are identical, but the left tower is ordered spawn order bottom to top, while the other one is ordered from the top to the bottom. So watch out for what happens with this block and with the Koopa at the top when we activate the platforms. The tower with the first spawn at the bottom doesn't hit the Koopa, but lands on top of the block. The tower with the first spawn at the top, however, doesn't land on the block, but kills the innocent Koopa. Hooray! We are reading the information how the POW blocks are sorted by killing or sparing Koopas. Next, let's read the information by using a giant gap. So here we have the following setup. We have two POW blocks in the middle. When activated, those POWs get carried into this spot where a skeleton roller coaster picks them up as soon as Mario triggers it. The POWs are then first carried upwards, where they pick up their buddy, the muncher, and afterwards they travel so far to the left that they are outside of the current camera loading border. There is a globally loaded pop-arm there that goes boom when the muncher travels into it and activates a POW block while booming. Meanwhile, Mario becomes entrapped in this spot where he activated the skeleton roller coaster and waits for a delicious yum yum mushroom to slowly travel towards his mouth. The mushroom is timed in such a way that Mario eats it while the skeleton roller coaster, POW block and muncher team travel downwards outside of the current camera border, which means that if the POW block that spawned first is at the bottom of the POW block muncher setup, nothing happens and the pop-arm goes boom. But if the first spawn is at the top, a wild giant gap appears and the muncher at the top despawns because of it, which means that no POW never gets triggered and Mario is entrapped here for eternity. Holy fuzzy. So in short, if Mario pushes the left POW block into the contraption first, then the exit will open up. But if he activated the other one first, nothing will happen. Let's take a look at another potential use case for this. Here we have a similar setup as before. The only difference is that this time the order in which the items spawn is randomized by pipes. The only way to get the key required to leave this area again is by activating the POW blocks in their reverse spawn order. Because only if they get stacked in reverse spawn order, no giant gap appears. Okay, so let's rewatch how the POWs spawned once again in slow motion. Okay, so this one spawned last, which means we have to activate it first. That one spawned before, then that one, and finally this one spawned first. So if everything worked out, Mario should be rewarded with the exit key. And hooray! It worked! Every other combination of POW block inputs would have led to the muncher disappearing and to Mario once again being entrapped for eternity. Okay, so that's basically the giant gap, POW block spawn order memory and different types of moving contact explained. So how to use this in a level? Honestly, I have no idea either. It's obviously an incredibly powerful way to express information in Mario Maker, but sadly it is so ridiculously complicated to work with that it is really difficult to come up with practical use cases for it. The problem isn't actually to find ways how to use this, the problem is more that it is surprisingly difficult to wire everything together in such a way that we can move our POW blocks around. If anyone wants to check out what is theoretically possible by chaining together those tricks, I highly recommend to take a look at some of Giant's levels. He built functional sliding puzzles, a Rubik's Cube and a Tower of Hanoi puzzle stage in Mario Maker using those techniques, and he's obviously incredible in general. Sadly, putting those tricks to good use is currently really difficult because of how limited we are in our options to sort, shuffle and move the POW blocks around. But there is actually a good chance that those tricks are going to be still possible in Mario Maker 2. See, those aren't glitches, those are just clever exploits of the way the Mario Maker loading and physics work, and I think there's a good chance that Mario Maker 2 is going to use the same physics as the first one did. And if that's the case, this would allow for crazy things in the sequel, because snake blocks give us a new option to carry items from A to B, which means that juggling and sorting POW blocks around probably becomes much easier. So hopefully those tricks are still a thing in the sequel. And with that being said, thanks for watching this Mario Maker lecture, I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and maybe you feel especially like you just finished your Mario Maker bachelor thesis today and want to hit the subscribe button as well. I hope that all of you have a wonderful day and to see you soon. Goodbye!